Welcome back. For many people, securing a legal name change could alter their life. For members of the trans community, a legal name change is a step towards making their identity on paper match their lived experiences. Director of Pro Bono Services for Legal Services NYC, Adam Heintz, and Staff Attorney for Brooklyn Legal Services, Julian Castronovo, join me to discuss this process and what they're doing to support this community. I want to thank you both so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Now, Adam, can you just talk about the inspiration behind the transgender name change clinic? I think this is really important because I think for a lot of people, they have a name that they're given and, they don't have to think about that. So, what was the inspiration behind, creating this clinic?
Well, I think you really put it perfectly at the beginning. This is a life-changing, in some cases, life-saving legal service that people desperately need, but they don't have a right to counsel for. So we created the project to really meet that legal need. I should add that we work at Legal Services NYC, which is a large poverty law organization. So we help more than 100,000 people each and every year across all of the essentials of life. So helping people to stay in their homes by fighting evictions, helping people to feel safe, helping people to secure better immigration status. And one of the passions that we have at our organization is making sure that we're properly serving the LGBTQ community. So we were one of the first poverty law organizations to create a unit that focuses on LGBTQ and HIV affected clients way back in the 1980s. So we've known for a long time that low-income LGBTQ people have a lot of substantial legal needs. And of course, getting a name change is one of the most important legal needs that we can meet for our clients.
That's amazing. Now, Julian, on June 24th, 2021, the Gender Recognition Act was signed into law. Can you actually just tell me and everyone else a little bit more about that act?
Yeah, so it mostly affects the name change law in New York, and for the longest time, the name change law in New York was pretty outdated, and it required people to publish their name changes in a newspaper. And for everyone, it created a bit of a privacy concern because it was somebody's name to what they were changing to, which is a pretty private decision regardless of gender identity. And then it also had you explain your address, where you lived, and you put that into the world. And so for trans people in particular, typically people are going from a gendered name to a differently gendered name. With their address, you were outing them not only as trans, but then also explaining where they live. So the Gender Recognition Act took the name change law and kind of modernized it. It took away publication because the legislature forever recognized that publication doesn't actually do what it did in the 1900s. Like in the 1900s, I didn't have Facebook to figure out what was happening with my community. So it took out publication. It made it so that courts couldn't instruct any sort of immigration authorities of a name change because those are totally different procedures. They don't matter to each other, and they just acted as a fear factor to a lot of undocumented communities. And then it also went around various parts of the law, and it made it make sense with the fact that gender and name changes are now a thing. So, for example, parents on birth certificates, if a parent was transgender and changed their name, they weren't able to change the name on their child's birth certificate up until this point. So it went in and also did that, amongst other things.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. That was really eye-opening because I'm like, the newspaper? Like, wow.
Right. Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, Adam, what do trans and non-binary people experience, when their ID doesn't match how they present to the world?
It's really an invitation to discrimination for every single person, entity they have to interact with where they need to show their ID. So if you can imagine in your own life, anytime you have to show your ID when you're, trying to access services at a hospital, for low-income people trying to access public benefits, anytime you have to interact with a police officer, even going into a bar, all the different various settings that you have to show your ID that maybe you don't think too hard about that. If that ID doesn't reflect your true gender identity and your name, it's really going to encourage people to both use the wrong name, of course, and the wrong pronoun, but also to recognize that you are transgender if they can see that you're presenting as a different gender than what they see on that ID. And so that means that our clients and transgender people generally with the wrong IDs have to deal with that day in and day out, multiple interactions. Sometimes people express ignorance. Sometimes people express hostility, and sometimes people, unfortunately, express violence or really intense bigotry. But whether a trans person experiences that that day when they're going out with their ID or not, they're living with that fear, with that expectation that anytime they're going to have to interact, to go to the hospital, to get that essential benefit, to be afraid of a police officer who's going to be coming and asking for an ID, they're living with that fear throughout their day. And it can really inhibit people's life. It can cause tremendous anxiety and fear. And again, really real impacts of discrimination when they occur. So I think that's a huge piece of it. And the other piece is just emotionally feeling like you're not recognized sort of legally in the world as who you are.
Now, what are some reasons that people may actually need assistance with this procedure?
Yeah, well, it should be an easier procedure. And as you heard from Julian, it's gotten better in recent years, but it's still a legal procedure. You still have to prepare a petition. You have to file it in court. There are fees associated with that. You have to comply with notice requirements that the court might order for you. And then you also have to figure out how you're going to update your key identity documents once you have the name change order, which requires additional steps with different agencies through the government. All of those things can be confusing. They can be expensive. They can be hard for people to access. For people who don't speak English fluently, they can create additional barriers. And again, for all the reasons I was just saying before, when you haven't had your name changed formally already, you're fearful of discrimination at every point that you're going to have to be interacting around that. So it's incredibly, important for people to have lawyers to do this for them so that it can be done right, so they don't have to live with that anxiety throughout the process. And with our project, we ensure that pro bono partners also pay all the fees associated with it. So they're with the client throughout the process, they're doing the legal work, and they're paying the fees. So it's just not something that's ever a barrier for a person seeking this relief.
I could imagine that it's probably also just very overwhelming, just like paperwork and just like all this stuff. So I think it's amazing that there's, access, So yeah, I think it's amazing that people are able, just to have assistance with this. Now, Julian, can you just talk about, what is this process like in New York? Who's allowed, to do this? Like, what are the steps in order to get that done?
Yeah, so Adam explained it pretty well, but in terms of who can get their name changed, anyone. The only requirement is that somebody is a resident of New York City, and residency is kind of a flexible standard, but you have an intent to reside in New York City. As long as you meet that, you can change your name. If you're under 18, there's some additional hurdles, burdens that you might have to go through with parental consent. If you are currently incarcerated, you are also able to change your name. So truly anyone can. And just as a reminder, resident of New York City doesn't mean resident of the United States. Somebody who's not, who doesn't have documentation to live in the United States can still change their name as long as they live in New York City. The process itself, for lawyers, it's easy.
Right.
You fill out a petition. It's kind of like a bunch of yes, no's that's asking you if you have debts and obligations to others. You fill it out, and then you submit it to a clerk. I'll say, even as an attorney, when I go to submit it to clerks, sometimes they give me a hard time. And I think about somebody who doesn't have legal training and doesn't know that they're allowed to fight back with a clerk, or at least argue back with a clerk. There's a lot of hurdles in between these stages that seem easy. So once you fill out the petition, you have to sign it, and then you also have to attach a birth certificate, proof of address, which technically isn't a requirement under the statute, but the court is requiring this now, and a photo ID. And then after that, it goes up to the judge. The judge makes a decision on the papers. The client no longer has to go before a judge to say why they want their name changed. The judge decides based on the petition in front of them, and then you go pick up your certified orders. And I think the way I think about it is you got your ticket, you got your golden ticket, and then you have to take that ticket to every agency that has your name to update it later.
And speaking of agencies and just organizations, can you just let people know what that means? Does that mean you have a bill to pay, you have to go to them? Can you just expand on that a little bit more?
It's really confusing because even in our understanding of how we assist people, so we assist people in updating federal identity documents. So that includes social security card and a passport. And like Adam said, our firms pay for that, which is a huge, huge thing because passports are upwards of $150, which is pretty unattainable for a lot of people. And then we also assist people in updating government IDs from New York. So that's your driver's license or your non-driver's ID. That can be a New York City ID, and that can be a New York birth certificate. Now, obviously, our names are everywhere and in a lot of non-governmental organizations and companies. So when it comes to your bank or your school or all of those places, each of those places is going to have a different process. And it's kind of on the individual to figure it out. And that's pretty tricky. But in general, just so people know, at least in New York City and state, they have to accept the name change. And if they don't, not only are they violating a court order, but they're also violating anti-discrimination laws in the city and state.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, Adam, can you just talk, just having this access to changing your name, just hearing it right now, it just seems so, I could see, why these services are available. As somebody like myself, I always was like, oh, I wish my name was something else. But it's a little bit different when it's like, when it's attached to your identity. Can you just talk about, why providing this access and, these services are just so important for people?
Absolutely. At a legal aid organization, we deal with a lot of hard things for clients, right? People who are facing domestic violence and need orders of protection, people facing eviction, all kinds of really difficult things. The legal need we just talked about around name changes is immense, but part of what's so amazing about it is that unlike almost everything else we do, securing a name change is liberatory for people. And I really mean that. It's something that frees our clients from all of these strictures of discrimination, this level of fear they've been having to interact with the whole world for, and it allows them to really be their true selves. So I think the impact of getting this service, of having your name changed, and of having it done in a respectful way where you're not struggling to pay the fees, where you're not scared of the process because you have a lawyer throughout it, is really transformative for clients.
Well, I think this is amazing. I've definitely learned so much just in this little bit of time. So I appreciate you both, coming here and talking about this.
Thank you so much.
If you need help with a name change or gender change, please go to Legal Services NYC's website at www.legalservicesnyc.org or follow them on social media at LSNYC News. We've come to the end of our show today. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us and for you, the viewers, for tuning in. If you missed any part of today's show, you can catch the recable cast at 5 and 10 p.m. on Optimum Channel 67 and Verizon Fios Channel 33, or watch anytime on the web at wrongside.org. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.